So since last time I talked about a movie, this time let's talk about a manga. Let's talk about My Hero Academia. Here's a question for you. What would you say the appeal of My Hero Academia is? Would you say it's a relatively optimistic series about a boy set in a school environment, trying to mesh together the hero's journey of mythology with the coming-of-age story of going from high school to adulthood, set in a nice little shonen bow? Or would you say it's a gritty, deconstructionist look at heroics, one that examines society's decline, the rot intrinsic in humanity, and the moral greatness that pervades everyone? If you said the second, you're wrong. You might also be the writer. Before we really get into it, there are going to be spoilers, so if you're not really caught up on the manga, then you don't want to be, this isn't going to be for you. Turn away now, because we can't really discuss anything that we're going to discuss without going into spoilers, and really heavy ones of that. So to start out, I'm just going to say that I was really on board with My Hero Academia when it first started. It's a very simple concept, and it's executed very well. It's a story about a boy who's given godlike powers and has to navigate high school. It's not that unique and not that strange a concept. It's the same setup that Harry Potter uses. It's the same setup of 1,000 other stories, because it's very hero with 1,000 faces. It's a very traditional setup. The thing that makes My Hero Academia stand out, the thing that makes it unique, is how it balances the optimism of the protagonist and his very almost pure worldview with the often realistic depictions of human beings in society, and the contrast and conflict between these two forces and viewpoints. I should also say that the series handles a lot of really Japanese themes, things like familial expectations, societal expectations, systemic isolationism, and more universal themes, things like whether or not it's a bad idea to elevate people into positions of power without really knowing anything about them. And it was at this point that I realized what this series reminds me of. This is just Watchmen in a high school setting. The same themes are present in both works. The idea that heroes are not innately moral goods, and the forces and the people that you put in charge might very well destroy you in the end. The idea that a society that is both dedicated to individual advancement while also being dedicated to a kind of collectivist good might create a situation where people who don't fit the mold or don't provide any kind of service are systematically disenfranchised and ostracized from the public square. However, the one way in which My Hero Academia differs from something like Watchmen is in the character of Izuku, the character who is a Superman-esque, very white-bread, moral individual who believes that heroics is a moral positive, who believes in a very black-and-white morality, who believes that a hero is somebody who shouldn't just do good, but model good behavior. He believes that ultimately human beings are good and worth saving, and not only that, that if a person can be saved, then they should be saved, regardless of what that person has done. This allows him to be the moral center of the work, but it also allows contrasts to be drawn between him and other people. It allows us to invest in his journey, and it allows his idealism to be tested against the backdrop of a society that sees heroes both as private sector public servants and as a commodity to be monetized, essentially. All of this is good. All of this is the appeal of the series. It allows us to invest in his journey. It allows us to invest in the journeys of the characters who he meets along the way, along the struggles that both they and he have to overcome. It's all very traditional, is the best way to put it. It's very hero with 1,000 faces. It all works. This contrast between a determined and optimistic protagonist and the greater society around him allows it to be more than just person versus person. It allows for a struggle of person versus society, and that's a great thing for a work like this. So let's just throw all that away, shall we? My Hero Academia is a very flawed work, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are lots of works that are flawed but still good and entertaining. A work doesn't have to be perfect, and I would argue that for like the first 300 chapters, the series manages to deal with its own flaws very well. It manages to balance the problems that I'm going to go into with the appeal of the series itself. However, My Hero Academia suffers from what you want to call death by 1,000 cuts, because it's not really one problem that crushes the entire series. It's the problems continuing to pile up and the writer not really doing anything about them, or in some cases actively making them worse. So let's just dive right in, shall we? Problem number 1. Izuku himself. Deku isn't a bad character on his face. In fact, he's the linchpin that makes the entire series work. The problem is that the writer doesn't really seem to know how to write a character like Deku and keep him interesting. Because it often feels like the creator is bored of having Deku as a protagonist, because he spends more time talking about the backstories and family members of completely different characters. We know more about Todoroki's home life and the home lives of his entire extended family and their experiences than we do about Deku's own life growing up. We know more about the backstory and motivations of Tamura than we do about Deku's own formation into the hero he wants to be. In fact, it often feels like the series would much rather have anyone else as a main character because it spends so much time on other characters and their own actions and interpersonal relationships. It almost feels like the writer is searching for a different main character than the one that they're actually trying to write. Now, it's worth pointing out that side characters being as important as the main character is not that odd in shonen. In fact, it's really not that odd in fiction in general. The 5-man band concept, for example, is a tried and true literary technique. It's really not that odd that the series has secondary main characters. But most series don't seem actively bored with the main character of the story that they're trying to tell. Part of this is that Deku becomes the worst kind of protagonist. He becomes the avatar character. For those that don't know what I'm talking about or referencing when I say an avatar character is one that is defined wholly by their powers or the force that gives them strength. It's a character that doesn't so much have characterization and their own traits, so much as they are an extension of whatever powers or abilities that they have. They are therefore an avatar for whatever is behind them, essentially. There are lots of side characters in many series who are avatar characters. There are also lots of villains that are avatar characters, because avatar characters make very good NPCs and villains, essentially. They are perfect for those kind of roles where a character can get away with being defined entirely by whatever power that they're using. What should happen in a story like this is that Deku starts as a character who doesn't have power and is then given power, and then the story is about how he takes this power that he's been given and makes it his own. For a good example of how this can work, look at Aang from Avatar: The Last Airbender. He is literally an avatar for another force, but he is not defined by that force. In fact, the entire series is about his personal struggle to be an individual and define himself against the backdrop of everyone else defining him based on the power that he's wielding. As My Hero Academia progresses, the series continually and increasingly treats Deku not as somebody who is using One for All as his own thing and that he is going to define, but as a character who is being defined by and used by One for All. His struggle takes a back seat to One for All's struggle in the battle against All for One. It becomes all about his power versus another power. It stops really being about him and his goals. Because suddenly, all the previous users of One for All begin to show up and become characters, and they're all starting to make demands of him. He's no longer defining the power, he's being defined by the power, and being defined by the needs and wants of all the previous users. It's no longer his struggle because it's no longer being defined in terms of what he wants to do. It's being defined in terms of what all the various people in One for All want to do. And some people are probably going to say, well, yeah, but isn't that kind of like how Frodo in Lord of the Rings is defined by him carrying the One Ring, and how he's on a journey, and how he's defined by him taking it there to be destroyed? No, because Frodo isn't being told what to do every step of the way by the ring. In Lord of the Rings, Frodo makes the conscious decision that it's the morally correct thing to do to destroy the ring, and as his journey progresses, he has to overcome various temptations and increasing hardship as it becomes harder and harder as he progresses towards his goal. Imagine if, instead of that, every step of the way, the ring was telling him what to do and how to do it and where he needed to go and what he needed to do, like the ring was a helicopter parent for Frodo. Because that's how One for All is. One for All being a Gestalt consciousness that feels the need to tell Deku about all of their lives and struggles and how he's a continuation of all of their various actions, completely undercuts the dynamic of Deku being an individual whose moral beliefs are the defining point of the series. Now, Deku being just another person in a long line of individuals isn't on its face a bad thing. The problem is that having these individuals then defining him and having them give him powers that then further define him as basically just an extension of them completely removes the appeal of the series of this character being an individual. To go back to Harry Potter for a second, imagine if instead of Harry Potter's reason for living was because of his mother's sacrifice, and instead was a power that was passed from person to person, and then because of that, the people who used to have that power spent all of their time telling him what to do. Imagine if he wasn't defined by his desire to do the right thing and avenge those who have been wronged, and instead was defined by the various motivations by the Gestalt consciousness in his head. It wouldn't be a very interesting story. Now, you can tell a story about a person who is struggling and failing to live up to the various hungry ghosts that are living in his head and demanding all of these things of him, things that they can't possibly do no matter how hard they try. But that's not the story that they're telling here. The series starts out with a very clear and defined main character. Deku is a character who doesn't have power, but is willing to struggle in order to both acquire power and also prove that he is worthy of that power. He is willing to endure great hardship in order to ensure that his view of what a hero is, his ideas regarding morality, are not dead or naive. It's all very Greek hero. It's all very Hercules or Odysseus. It's somebody who suffers, which is what makes them a hero. But then Deku is redefined not as somebody who is struggling to both find himself and develop as a human being, but as an avatar for a bunch of people who we've never met and have no experience with and no attachment to, and whose struggles we don't care about because we have no reason to, because we've never heard of them before. We, the audience, do not care about the struggles of One for All the power against All for One. We, the audience, care about the struggles of Deku versus the person of All for One. These are not the same thing. And keep in mind, these are just the problems with Deku himself. I haven't even touched on the problems of the world itself. Here's a law for aspiring writers. The bigger your world is, the bigger your problems are going to be. Now, that might seem obvious, but it's one of those things that writers don't really imagine, because the bigger the scale of your story, the bigger the scale of your problems are going to be, because you're introducing your readers to concepts and things that you might not have even considered. To give another example from Harry Potter, I can tell you the exact moment that the scope of the series exceeded the writer's ability to handle that scope. It's the beginning of book 3, and Harry is reading a letter from his friend Ron about how the Weasleys are in Egypt and exploring Egyptian pyramids and how some of them might be cursed. Okay, stop, you've lost me. The idea of a hermetic ideal of a wizard, one with wands and spells and living in a castle, all of that works if your story is set in relatively modern day England, because we don't really need to think about the ancient world at all. it hasn't been brought up because it's not relevant to the story that's being told. But by introducing this element, by introducing the fact that they're in ancient Egypt and that the pyramids might be cursed, it brings up a whole bunch of questions that the author is not interested in answering and thus is not going to answer. Questions like, did magic exist in ancient times? Were or are there other magical traditions other than the ones being studied at Hogwarts? Ideas and cultures flow naturally between people over time, so are there still ancient Egyptian wizards out there? How much of the world that we see through Harry's eyes is actually reflective of the greater world itself? Now, some might say, well, none of that's really relevant to the story, and you'd be right. And my retort to that is, so why did you bring it up in the first place? In My Hero Academia, we, the audience, are already willing to accept the idea of heroes being sort of private sector public servants. We are willing to accept that there is a level of commercialization that goes along with this, as well as boring things like them living in office buildings and doing paperwork and having brand deals. All of this is stuff we're willing to accept. As a result, we can also accept things like not all of the people who are acting as heroes are being heroes for what we might consider the right reasons. They are being heroes for selfish, self-serving reasons. And again, that's something that we, the audience, can accept. But problems begin occurring the second the scope is widened, because we start learning things that don't mesh with our understanding of the world. For example, we learn that police are not allowed to use their quirks, which seems odd because police are specifically designed to be trained to handle situations. They're designed to handle problems. So wouldn't you expect the people who are most trained to deal with, like, normal problems be the ones allowed to use their quirks? You would think that they're at least more trained than a bunch of first-year high schoolers whose extent of training is really not all that good. So hold on a second. Why are you having teenagers act as the SWAT team level of your private sector public servants? Because that seems like a giant oversight. What exactly does a 15 or 16-year-old have in terms of training or knowledge or life experience that makes them more equipped to use their quirks in danger than somebody in a police force that is better trained and has more experience? Actually, you can ignore that for a moment. Why are you having the people who are ostensibly being trained to be the police, ostensibly, why are they learning things like English lit and math and biology? You wouldn't like grab a SWAT team member and be like, well, before you can be a SWAT team member, you need to learn English literature. And speaking of being trained to be living SWAT teams, the character of Bakugo is a problem. In fact, constantly a problem. I don't mean that they're violent, and I don't mean that they're a bad person. I mean that this is a character who has violent spasms and anger issues to the point where they have to be chained up during a public event to avoid beating another student to death with their bare hands. Meaning that they are not constrained by public opinion or private opinion or things like personal respect in any sense of the word, which makes it very odd that you would decide to say, yeah, that person should be put in charge of protecting children. Like, this is psychotic level emotional problems that are on display, and yet no one at any point in the government or the schooling system seems to have thought to do any psychological screening of applicants. At all. Here's a question. What sort of emotional problem would be bad enough for them to deny you, knowing what we know about Bakugo's personal beliefs? Do they just take in anyone, regardless of their emotional or mental beliefs? Do they just, like, grab anybody who has the capability, regardless of how they feel about the people who they're supposed to be protecting? Like, I know he's meant to grow as time goes on, but it's really hard to look at someone and go, yeah, that guy looks like he's put together. The point I'm making is that the more questions you make us, the audience, ask, the more answers you're going to have to provide, because if you don't, then nothing makes any sense. And this problem of not providing answers and things making less and less sense only gets worse as the series progresses. For example, in the most recent chapters, All for One has broken out of prison and decided to let a whole bunch of other inmates out of prison, the result of which is the complete downfall of Japanese society. I don't mean like a temporary or even a localized collapse of public order. I mean that Japan has suddenly become the Fallout universe, and people are living in burned out skyscrapers and burning things in trash cans because all of society has collapsed by prisoners getting out of prison. Apparently, one major disaster was the only thing standing in the way of complete and total societal collapse. It was also apparently the one thing that would cause a bunch of heroes who are private sector public servants to suddenly decide to just pack up and leave, although I don't know where they're going because Japanese society has collapsed. Apparently, there just wasn't any kind of backup plan at all. And what makes this worse is that the series deliberately acknowledges this by saying that other nations' militaries are thinking about getting involved, that heroes from other countries are thinking about intervening. Actually, hold on a second. Where exactly is the Japanese military at the moment? Are you saying that in the years that All Might was active, that he was the only thing that was standing between Japan and complete societal collapse, that during his time as top hero, Japan just decided to abolish its armed forces and anyone who could do anything as simple as disaster relief? Did they seriously just think to themselves, you know what, we're just going to privatize the entirety of our disaster relief programs and our own personal safety, because privatizing all of that sounds like a wonderful idea. To put it another way, what exactly is stopping a Doctor Doom or Black Adam situation from occurring? For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, in Marvel Comics, Doctor Doom is a super powerful character who rules over the country of Latveria in Eastern Europe as a dictator. And also, in DC Comics, Black Adam is a character with lots of power who seized control of a Middle Eastern country and now rules over it as a dictator thanks to his overwhelming power. So what exactly is stopping this from happening in Japan in the My Hero Academia universe? Actually, what was stopping it before then? Does this happen in the My Hero Academia universe? In a world where everyone has superpowers, do people who have powers seize control of governments in other countries, exactly? Is that a thing? What exactly was stopping somebody else in some other part of the world from just waltzing into Japan and defeating All Might and taking over the country? Because if All Might was the only thing that was standing between Japanese society and total anarchy, that's a problem. That's not even, necessarily a literary problem. That's, just the logical problem. Bit of a random side note here. There are a lot of series that come out from Japan recently that have also been about, the complete breakdown of society. Things like Blue Exorcist and Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man. Are you okay, Japan? Is something going on that, we in the West are not aware of? Anyway, my point with all of this is that the bigger the scale of your story, the more problems you're going to have. And the fact is, the more elements that you introduce, the more questions we, as the audience, are going to end up asking. And if you don't keep all of this straight, your story and your world start to look less and less coherent. There's a reason why a lot of fantasy stories take place in other universes and not just grafted on to the real world, because the more things that you do and change in a world we already understand, and the more you assume that you don't have to explain things because the world is similar to the one we live in, the worse it's going to be when you start changing major aspects of that world. I should also point out that this is mostly a problem because the series is moving too fast and too slow at the same time. The series is called My Hero Academia, but the protagonist has only really completed about 6 months worth of high school at this point, and yet the entire world has just collapsed. Hi, yes, it's me, the audience again. Why did you make the character a first-year high school student if you were going to have the entire world collapse within the first semester of his enrollment? Look, not every series needs to be a 1,000-chapter, 10-year journey. But if you're going to juxtapose the hero's journey with a person going through high school, then the school part needs to be a bit more relevant and a bit more emphasized. Because at the moment, Deku, who has at most 6 to 8 months of use of his powers, is currently teaming up with the 3 best heroes in society who have years, if not decades, of experience in order to try to fix all of Japanese society. He, with less than a year's worth of experience with his own powers, is being held up as on the same level with the people who have been doing it for years and years. And if that's the case, if realistically speaking it only took him like 6 months to be this good, why exactly did you set it in a school to begin with? Like, why is the series called My Hero Academia if the academia part is barely an afterthought? Like, why is the series set in a high school if the high school part is not integral to the direction of your character? Because right now, in the story, the high school is being used as a refugee shelter, and you can't write a high school coming-of-age story in this environment. The better way to write this story would be to have Deku being a third-year student, with 1 semester left to go, and his idealism and his hopes clashing into the reality of then going out into society. Thus, 6 months later, after the beginning of the series, when he's graduating, this also coincides with the sudden collapse of society, and all of his plans and hopes and dreams are thrown up into the air. This transitions nicely with the fact that he now has to fight the big bad evil guy, and establishes that the end of one journey is also the beginning of another. But none of this is the story that they're actually telling. Instead, Deku is on his own, fighting with the top 3 heroes in his field, and even, on top of this, states that he has no intention of going back to school. You realize that you called your series My Hero Academia, right? That the school part is kind of important. Imagine if, after the first book of Harry Potter, Harry decided he didn't feel like being a wizard anymore, and instead decided he wanted to be a lawyer. And so, The Prisoner of Azkaban isn't about Sirius Black escaping from prison, it's about 13-year-old lawyer Harry Potter trying to get his uncle out of prison. Imagine if, in Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aang, after Book 1, decided he no longer wanted to be the Avatar, and instead settled down to be a wheat farmer, and then the whole series was about the struggles of being a wheat farmer during wartime. Imagine if Lord of the Rings wasn't about Frodo trying to destroy the One Ring, and instead, after getting halfway to Mordor, Frodo goes, you know, I've always wanted to start that ring-making business, and the rest of the series was essentially about Frodo making rings. Imagine if, in Fallout, there was no actual nuclear fallout, and instead they just kept all the imagery, for seemingly no reason. Imagine if, in Naruto, Naruto died before he ever got to the point in Shippuden, and instead they just kept the name, for seemingly no reason. Imagine if, like, Mortal Kombat was like, yeah, a long time ago we solved things through Mortal Kombat, but now we solve them through poetry. Why on earth did you call your series My Hero Academia if you were going to toss out the academia part within 6 months of him being in academia? Why are you casting aside a huge part of your series identity for seemingly no reason at all? Speaking of identity, let's go back to that for a second, because at the beginning of this video, I asked you, the viewer, what the appeal of My Hero Academia was. And what I said is that My Hero Academia was an upbeat show for the most part, with an optimistic worldview that also handled relatively dark elements and some serious tones in a mature way. Even though it had those dark elements, it was still mostly optimistic that, at their core, most people are good. Except now, My Hero Academia is a gritty, deconstructionist look at heroics, as if this is Watchmen with a protagonist who is 16. We've completely jettisoned the optimism of the series, and we've replaced it with an apocalyptic setting, like it's Mad Max or Fallout. Like, we've completely thrown out the juxtaposition of the hero's journey with the coming-of-age story of high school. In essence, everything that has made the series popular in marketing and advertising, and most of the reasons that people love the anime, have not been completely thrown out the window. What, was the author bored of his own series? That's what I mean when I say that the series is moving too fast and too slow at the same time. It's jumped to the end of the story, but in terms of actual in-universe time progression, it's moving way too slow. And again, on their own, each of these things is not necessarily a problem. It's the fact that each one of these problems has built on top of each other to the point where it's crushing the entire series. Because understand, you cannot narratively raise stakes like this, and then after this point, after the point where you've said that society has collapsed, go back to being a lighthearted, like, slice-of-life hero story set in high school. You can't do that. You've already shown us death and destruction on a nationwide scale. You can't suddenly cut back to hormonal teenage love problems after this. To go back to Harry Potter again, imagine if in the 6th and 7th books, the darker, grittier tone when they're fighting a war was instead taking place in the 2nd and 3rd books, and then in the 4th book, all of a sudden, for reasons that are unexplained, Harry went back to Hogwarts and engaged in completely normal behavior after some of his friends have been murdered in wartime. None of this would work at all, because that's literally not how literary pacing works. Again, it's not that the series is awful, it's not that the series is irredeemable, it's the problem of there are so many unenforced errors that continue to pile on again and again and again. If you just told the story the way you're supposed to tell stories, none of these problems would exist. There is zero reason to jettison the core concept of your series. There is no reason to throw away all of the juxtaposition and everything you've built up in what is ostensibly the middle of the first act. But hey, I'm not a manga creator, so for all I know, the anime fans will just absolutely love this development. Or, you know, maybe we've now reached the end of Game of Thrones part of this series' lifespan.